Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our Terrell County Virtual Lunch and Learn series. I'm Jessica McCrory, and I'm the County Extension Agent of Terrell County. We hope you enjoy this series over the next 2 weeks. We will be recording this session and the upcoming sessions for future viewing and for you to pass along to other folks. At the conclusion of this program, there will be an evaluation available. It's only a few questions long, and so please consider filling it out for us. It should not take more than 5 minutes to complete. The link to the evaluation is on the same page as the link to this Zoom session was. And now to our program. Today we have Dr. John Tomachek talking about integrated wildlife damage management with a focus on mountain lions, black bears, and coyotes. Dr. Tomachek is an assistant professor and wildlife specialist for Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. He's worked on carnivore ecology, disease management, and more programs throughout the state. So, Dr. Tomachek, it is all yours.
Well, thank you very much, Jessica. It's always fun to visit with y'all. And in the world of working on carnivores and other things that may cause problems, or you may just enjoy seeing them, West Texas is always just a tremendously fun place to work. And so, y'all, in visiting with Jessica ahead of this talk, there's always a lot we can do. And I feel like everybody has got a fair amount of slideshow, PowerPoint fatigue, and Zoom fatigue. And so we're going to try this just as a conversational here. I've got some ideas and some thoughts to talk about, and I'm sure you've got some questions. And Jessica, I'm sure you've got some things that y'all deal with out there. So at any time, feel free, interject, ask a question. I'm really here as a resource for you. And really, it's one of those things where the best stuff we usually come up with to talk about comes from real life problems that folks deal with. And I appreciate Jessica starting out with that term, integrated wildlife damage management, because this is how we approach the issues we have with wildlife damage from native wildlife. If you're talking about a pest problem, let's say you're growing a garden and you've got some kind of cutworm killing your garden plants, then we're talking about integrated pest management. We have no value for that pest, that insect, and we really want to get rid of them using every tool in the toolkit. That's an IPM approach. The same is true when we're dealing with feral hogs, right? There's no value for them in the system. They cause problems, and we just want to get rid of them using every tool that we have in that toolkit. When it comes to our native wildlife that cause damage, we kind of have a conundrum there, because perhaps in the old days, in my grandparents' time and before, there really wasn't much value recognized for those animals in our part of the world. And so our goal was to get rid of them in favor of management of livestock or anything else. Or in the old days, when we still had grizzly bears in West Texas, believe it or not, folks said, well, golly, they eat people, so let's get rid of them. But as time's gone on, we've realized that those animals play really important roles in the system. And so we've started to talk about this integrated wildlife damage management. So the idea is, I don't necessarily like the damage I'm experiencing. Who does? But I know that animal has some value. So I want to use every tool in my toolkit to deal with the damage, get that animal to quit causing me problems. And in that way, we can coexist at least as well as we can. And I think that's an important thing for us to recognize. And you've probably heard me talk before, and I talk a lot about understanding the nature of damages from different animals and why they occur and when they occur. And I talk a lot about identifying predation from carcasses. But Jessica presented me with these 3 species. She said, we got mountain lion issues, coyote issues, and bears are coming back to West Texas. And folks are trying to wrap their heads around what are the problems with each of those? How do we deal with them? And how do those animals go about living their lives? And so one thing I want to kind of lay out just before we begin, remember, the legalities here are a little bit interesting. According to the law of the state of Texas, both mountain lions and coyotes have no legal status, right? They're not protected in any fashion. But bears, on the other hand, black bears, are completely protected by state law. There's no legal way to take a bear. And so that one gets to be tricky. So when we're having issues with bears, it really is important to work with Texas Parks and Wildlife Department and work with our friends at USDA Wildlife Services, because those are our government agency folks who are tasked with dealing with our native wildlife and can help us navigate those problems. So I always encourage people, remember, if you think you're having issues from bears, let's talk about it. We're all here as resources that are wildlife professionals, and we're here to help you out. When I think about the winter time and I think about things in theory are going to cool down pretty soon and we're going to move into the fall winter time of year, it's an interesting thing that we deal with on the damage world. So in our climate, because it never really gets completely cold, bears do not hibernate like they might in other places. Now, they'll sleep for a while and they'll definitely be a lot less active, but they don't necessarily sleep all winter long. And so people will say, well, golly, John, we saw those bears out and about. We don't know what to do and this and that. And it's an interesting problem. So when you think about bears, they're coming back to Texas and in various areas, West Texas more strongly than anywhere else. It's important to remember that a grizzly bear and a brown bear, or excuse me, grizzly bear and a black bear are not the same thing. Grizzly bears, we don't have anymore. Historically, they would have been in Western Texas in the high country. But those animals are primarily carnivorous and they do a lot of live predation, a lot of scavenging. Black bears, on the other hand, are primarily, they're an omnivorous species that eats just a tremendous amount of plant matter when it's available, right? Things that are high nutrient value and out there all the time. And it's something I like to point out to people when you're dealing with any kind of large mammal that's not a herbivore, right? Omnivores or carnivores, they're all inherently a little bit lazy. And it's probably not fair to call them lazy, but what we're dealing with is the balance between how much energy does it take for me to make a meal and how much energy do I get from it. You know, chasing something down, killing it, and then eating it takes a lot of energy for the calories I'm getting back. So scavenging is a pretty common strategy for most animals out there, and bears included, or eating plant matter if you can, because it doesn't run away. And so we'll see quite a lot of consumption from bears on things like deer feeders, right? Shelled corn, they can eat it just fine. Protein pellets, they can eat them just fine. Or if you are using something like a roasted soybean, they can eat that stuff just fine, no problem. And in our part of the world where it's dry and there's not necessarily a lot of food out there, it's a very attractive resource. So going into winter, your bears are going to try to build up a store of fat. They're going to try to build up essentially calories in reserve so that they don't have to rely on what's available in the winter because it's fairly little that's out there. And I think that's something to bear in mind when we do see bears in this part of the world this time of year and they're hitting deer feeders and these kinds of things. They're looking for cheap, easy meals. And there's all kind of ways to deal with that. But one of the most effective things with black bears, if you can get it to ground out properly, is using electricity and electric fencing to keep them off of stuff. God, they hate electricity. There's a number of places in the Western US where they use it to guard well sites, you know, water wells, food, you name it. And bears do not like electricity. They respond pretty well to it. Texas Parks and Wildlife, in conjunction with Extension, has got a few really nice pamphlets on using electricity to manage bear damage. But another thing I like to point out this time of year, because bears are such incredible scavengers, we might have kills out there on the landscape that other wildlife have done, right? Or livestock just die or other wildlife just die and bears scavenge on it. And I always encourage people in the world of predation ID, when you're looking to assign blame, don't be so quick just to assume that the animal you see feeding on something is the one that killed it. Oftentimes, if I were a young bear in Western Texas, if I was a smart bear, I would follow a mountain lion around, right? Wait for a mountain lion to make a kill, and then I'd scavenge later. To compare those two animals, we'll get into more into lions in just a second. To compare those two animals, lions are obligate carnivores, which means they do not have the ability to eat plant-based foods. They have to eat meat, and they have to eat fairly fresh meat. They do not do well with stuff that's gone rotten. And so your mountain lion is going to kill a deer-sized animal every several days in order to have enough food to eat. Whereas your bear can eat on anything that contains a calorie and can scavenge a lot of stuff it's gotten pretty old and pretty rank, shall we say. So if you see a bear out there feeding on a carcass, whether wildlife or livestock, don't assume right away that it did the killing. Bear damage and bear killing, the evidence of them actually killing that animal is fairly obvious, right? And it's one of those things that if you do see it, you won't mistake it. But just a bear feeding on livestock and wildlife doesn't indicate they ate it. And there's a number of ways in which bears feed they're fairly obvious, right? So if bear's going to kill something, usually the death blow happens. They hold that animal down, and you may have a broken back and broken pelvises, but then they usually bite the back of the head and the top of the shoulders and crunch down on it pretty significantly. That kind of large wound is unlike anything else that happens out there. Now, when they're feeding on it, bears are very prone to peeling skin off, peeling skin back, right? Kind of skinning that animal out, and then eating everything on the inside. You may also see a bear come in and scavenge on something that's been out there for several days. And in some cases, they're actually farming the insects that are emerging from that carcass as it rots. And so a bear will sit there and pick bugs and stuff off. I know it's not lunchtime talk really, but they're extremely efficient at making a meal. In the middle of the winter, typically you don't see bears all that often. But right now, what we have going on is a number of our bears are moving around, especially in the drought conditions we have across much of Texas and northern Mexico. And they are moving distances either to try to find somewhere with resources, or you have young bears that have been kicked off mama and they're essentially juveniles still. They're teenagers and they're trying to find a place to call home. So they're moving around. So it might seem to us as though we've got an explosion of bears all at once, but really they're out there moving around. So this is something that leads me to another point. This time of year, I typically get calls from people and they get very upset and they say, "Oh my gosh, John, we're seeing just a ton of coyotes out there this year, and God, they're all over the place." And these calls for me typically start in mid-October and they'll run through about the 1st of February. I get the same kind of phone call. And what it is, when we have coyotes, it's an interesting kind of situation. So coyotes also, they're an omnivorous animal. They do a lot of scavenging. They'll eat plant matter. They'll do some live predation, typically on things that are deer sized and smaller. And I emphasize the smaller part. And oftentimes this time of year, what we're seeing is that the animals that were born not this year, but the year before, and sometimes this year's pups, are old enough, they're getting kicked out, right? Because if you were born not in 2020, but in 2019, by now you've reached sexual maturity and it's time for mom and dad to kick you out. So they're getting kicked off. And even the animals that are already adults, they're wandering around looking for mates for the springtime. And in research we've done recently, there's not a whole lot of stick to itness with animals not moving around. They're moving to find mates. And that means that you're seeing them more because they're traveling greater distances and traveling more. And this will continue until about the end of January when breeding season really ramps up. So it's interesting too, because typically you will have a number of producers that shift lambing or kidding to the wintertime, and that helps you avoid a number of parasite issues, but it also helps you avoid some amount of predation because your other alternative is your spring lambing or spring kidding or somewhere in that middle of the year. And those coyotes at that point, they have whelped and they've got pups to feed, or you've got a pregnant mama if she hasn't whelped yet, which means very high nutritional requirements. And so you've got to do a lot of feeding and you've got to have a lot of fresh food to feed. Typically in the wintertime, based on various studies that have been done, I mean, coyotes do a fair amount of scavenging, but another thing they do, or they do a fair amount of predation, but another thing they do a whole lot of this time of year is scavenging. And it's interesting. Remember, they're a fairly small animal, right? So unlike a large bear, it doesn't take a lot of food to keep them fed. And in the wintertime, things die. They die of starvation, they die of disease, they die of old age, anytime they're in a stressed condition and the climate's a little harsh on them. So coyotes do an awful lot of scavenging in the wintertime. They manage to feed themselves, not entirely, but in a large part on the carrion, those scavengeable dead animals that are on the landscape. Which brings us back to talking about our mountain lions. Remember, our lions are, as I said before, obligate carnivores. Now, your bears and your coyotes, they are the ultimate food generalist. They'll eat anything that contains a calorie. They'll try anything. In the drought of 2011 in eastern Texas, even, we had coyotes eating corn from deer feeders. Now, I'm sure they were there hoping that something would show up that they could eat, but they were out there eating the corn as well. And that's just because, although it's inefficient, they could make a little bit of energy out of it. Mountain lions, on the other hand, they do not have an option to do anything in the plant world. They have to eat meat, they have to eat animal protein. And even scavenging can be very rough on them. They don't do well with it per se. So, you in Western Texas live in an interesting place. Normally, and I say across most of their range, mountain lions typically run country, run areas that they use regularly in a size of 100 to 200 square miles that they're running in a regular interval. So, for example, over near College Station, we have a few lions that we know of, and there is one of our faculty there in the wildlife program on their place east of College Station. They'll see a lion about twice a year. It shows up consistently and regularly, but it's moving incredible country, I'm sure. In Western Texas, for whatever reason, Western Texas, Eastern New Mexico, Southeast New Mexico, and parts of Northern Mexico, lion density is surprisingly high. Now, we don't know why that is. They tend to operate in, if not smaller country, a lot of overlapping country out there. Now, that could be because water resources are fairly limited, and so they've got to all stack up where the water does exist because they've got a high water requirement. But regardless of what happens, you end up with animals that have to engage in live predation. They have to, and they're large, so they need a lot of food and they overlap. So what we see with lions is very interesting. We tend to see individual animals specialize in certain kinds of prey items. So they might specialize in eating mule deer. They might specialize in eating, I don't know, anything out there, right? Bighorn, if they could get them. They'll specialize in eating porcupines, skunks. I mean, you name it. When we've seen diet studies done out in that part of the world, typically what happens is you'll see an individual and the bulk of their diet is one particular kind of animal. And then they'll have a little bit of the other stuff, right? But they've learned to specialize. And in that way, those animals can exist with other of their species without competing a whole lot. So they manage to partition all that food, which for us may suit us just fine if it's porcupines and skunks and raccoons, and we don't really care too much about those things. But when we get into situations of livestock predation, or we get into situations where we have economically important wildlife, mule deer, or even though you can't sell hunts on bighorn yet, if they're killing bighorn, that's hurting us in the long run, right? Because we're looking to restore that species. Those are tough. And recognizing we need mountain lions in the system because they help deal with an abundance of prey animals. Imagine if you didn't have stuff like lions out there as a large predator helping keep numbers down. With the fairly limited rainfall that country gets, you could get overpopulated with herbivorous animals in a hurry. And so those predators are a natural check valve for our ecosystem to keep it from getting abused by native wildlife. The problem gets to be when we have those damage situations. And so we may need to find that we remove a specific lion that is engaging in predation on livestock. Now, the handy thing about lions is that they tend to kill an animal and come back to the same carcass a few nights in a row to feed on it. They're efficient that way. So if you have a kill that you can determine to be a lion, you can trap that animal at the carcass site when it comes back. Now, the troubling thing for that is that in the environment where we also have bears, as I said earlier, a smart bear would follow a mountain lion around and scavenge off of their kills. We want to be recognizing that if we set trapping equipment around a lion kill, we may very well catch a bear by accident. And we need to be planning for avoiding that, or if it does happen, for working with the appropriate authorities and safely releasing that bear. Because bear's just there to help clean up, not doing any damage per se. So we always want to identify when we do have a kill, who's responsible for it versus who's feeding on it. Because our bears and our coyotes, they're incredible scavengers, and they help clean up all that material out there and not have disease transfer to other wildlife and other livestock. But we want to be sure that we know what we're dealing with if we're going to catch something at a kill site. So in the wintertime, remember, our lions aren't resting, our lions aren't sleeping, our lions have got to continue to engage in predation all winter. So we bear in mind what it looks like when a mountain lion kills livestock or kills wildlife. And pretty classically, it's easy to identify a lion kill in two ways. They're going to go ahead and grab the throat just like many of our carnivores do and strangle that animal to death. But you'll see fairly large tooth wounds, right? The teeth are 3/8 of an inch in diameter, and you'll have a set of uppers and lowers on that animal. So if you see this damage, skin out around the neck and the throat, and look at those tooth wounds. And if there's a lot of fresh bleeding and a lot of what amounts to bruising, it's this hemorrhagic staining on the underside of the skin, you can say fairly confidently that that animal died or died. That animal was still alive or was in the process of dying when the animal that bit it there handled it. And then after that, you'll see lions cache this stuff, right? So they'll try to cover it up, bury it with leaves and brush and other stuff, anything they can manipulate. And so it's important to recognize lions have got to do that. Lions are not incredible chase predators. They rely on ambush. And so oftentimes these kills are going to happen, especially in Western Texas, in those low spaces and those saddles in the mountains and in the hills and the high country where you do have tree cover, even if it's a small amount and you've got some other vegetation growing, rather than out in the open on the floor of the valley or somewhere like that. Again, those things happen, but you'll see lions will drag those animals back to cover. And a powerful animal like a mountain lion can pick up something the size of a deer and drag it straight line 60, 100 yards without too much trouble. And so we look at these kind of behaviors and we try to understand what is it I'm dealing with and what's the source of the problem. Now, to come full circle on this, when we get into a drought time and when we're also grazing that country, native wildlife, native herbivores, our predators act as a check valve. And when they get a little overpopulated, they get knocked back. But the problem we run into in the livestock world is if we're trying to beat the market and survive a dry time and we can just barely get through it. And look, I grew up in a livestock raising family. And the secret to success in a drought is to be the one family that survived it and still had animals they haven't liquidated yet. But the problem we get into is when that range gets very denuded of grass cover, not a lot of vegetation out there, we lose a lot of those prey animals like your rabbits and your rats and other mesomammals like skunks and raccoons even. We take away that prey that those coyotes and those bears might be looking towards, and we're left with not a whole lot but bare ground, some brush, and livestock. And that's a recipe for disaster in the wintertime, where we will get a lot of predation from our native wildlife on our livestock. And that can be a tough one, right? You recognize why it happened. Nobody intended to damage the landscape because you rely on that land for your livelihood, but those things do happen. And when they do, it's important to recognize what are all of the tools in your toolkit to deal with that issue, whether that's a lethal tool or a non-lethal tool. And we won't necessarily get into all of them today, but livestock guardian dogs can be a tool in your toolkit. They can be fairly effective, especially with coyotes. People ask me, John, can they work on bears? They can, but you have to make sure that you're working with the right kind of dogs to do that. I would encourage you to remember in the mountains of Central Europe, up in Poland, they deal with brown bears, which are basically the same species as grizzly bears. A grizzly is a subspecies of a brown bear. And they deal with brown bears on sheep and goats, mostly wool sheep up in the high country. And they have dogs that help protect those sheep from the brown bears. And the way they handle it, they gather their sheep, they pen their sheep, and they have dogs that keep an eye on the penned sheep and chase the bears off. That can work. But it's not necessarily always the same dog that's ready to go deal with, something small like a coyote. So we got to be sure that we're planning our tools, lethal and non-lethal, that are appropriate for the animals we're dealing with, right? You would not set the same kind of trap set for a mountain lion that you would for a coyote. You wouldn't be as effective catching them. So we got to figure out what that animal is causing damage. And after we figure out what we're dealing with, go make sure we're getting the right tool that's going to be most effective dealing with that problem, but won't necessarily impact non-targets that aren't causing us a problem yet. Now, Jessica, I've been rambling around this topic for darn near half an hour now. Is there anything I've said for you or for the folks in the room that's raised questions in your mind you'd like to delve into a little more?
I'll open it up to them. I don't have any questions as of right now. Learning a lot, though, for sure.
You bet. You bet. This for me, y'all. I'm sorry?
Unmute. I was telling them they're welcome to unmute and ask questions if they have any. Or write in the chat box. I have the chat box open too. I can read it too.
Yep. And I would say to y'all, as bears make a comeback, I like to tell everybody there's no shortage of good information out there on how to deal with bear issues. And a lot of it's property damage when bears are foraging around in the trash or looking for something easy to eat. I used to live in Southwest New Mexico up in the mountains, and we had no shortage of bear issues, but there's a good solution for most of them already that's non-lethal. If it's electricity or a different kind of way to secure a garbage can or a dumpster, there's no shortage of solutions. So don't just throw your hands up in frustration and say, well, golly, it's hopeless. It's not. It just requires doing something a little bit differently than we had before.
I'm not seeing any questions, but I do know that we had talked about before about doing the predator kill ID program here, hoping that next year maybe we'll open back up and COVID won't have us so restricted that we can actually do that here in the county. I think a lot of landowners will get some use out of that.
Yeah, I think that's great, Jessica. And, for example, not to say where it was or I don't even know whose place it was on. As you know, I get a lot of photos for predation ID that folks send me. And I got one not that long ago from West Texas that was somebody was concerned. They had seen bears and they had some dead sheep and they thought that the bears were doing the killing. And man, they took some great photos and they were sent over to me. And I took a look at it and they didn't tell me much about the situation. They just say, oh, we saw a bear. And I looked at it for a little bit and I said, it's a little bear, isn't it? And they said, yeah, how did you know? I said, but not a cub, like kind of gangly looking, awkward teenager. Yeah. How'd you know? And I said, well, when little bears feed on things and scavenge on them, they kind of make little ribbons or little strings out of the tendons in the muscle because they're not very efficient yet. So they kind of strip muscle off tendon. But this is a fairly small bear. I said, so, show me the bite wounds on the neck if you can find them. And they had a fresh kill and they showed them to me. I said, oh no, that's a mountain lion kill. And it's a very smart teenager that's following that lion around. And so it can be tempting because, as landowners, livestock raisers, we see a bear feeding on one of our animals. That gets us very upset. And our human minds want to connect A to B and go, that's what happened. But by comparison, we did have a sheep owner, sheep raiser, or a goat raiser. I'm trying to remember which one it was in West Texas a couple of years ago that had a bear kill a goat, I believe it was, and watched it happen. Okay, that's hard to argue at that point, right? You see it happening and then, it is what it is. But if you don't see it in the act, I always encourage everybody, go collect that information because it's not just to say that we're trying to only take care of the animals that are causing problems. We are, but if that's not enough for you, it really does impact your pocketbook at the end of the day in terms of lost time and lost money on managing things that weren't actually the problem.
Right. All right. I'm not seeing any more questions.
Well, very good. Look, y'all, I appreciate the opportunity to dial in and visit with you. It's just a ton of fun for me. So if questions do come up later, Jessica knows how to get in touch with me very easily, and I'm always happy to hear from y'all.
Sounds good. Well, thank y'all for attending the first of the Terrell County Virtual Lunch and Learn series. Just a reminder about filling out the evaluation. Again, it can be found on the same page that you found the link for this Zoom session under the events on the Terrell County AgriLife page. And thank you, Dr. Tomachek, for the presentation.
Thank you, Jessica. Glad to be here.
We hope to see everyone again tomorrow for part 1 of our Brush Busters program with Dr. Morgan Treadwell.